petition is reaching its third day now. It's a local resident calling for cheaper flight prices out of Coffs Harbour. I think everyone who's lived on the Mid-North Coast would have a story of looking at the prices out of the Coffs Airport and comparing them with other regional airports such as Ballina and Port Macquarie and seeing that they are more expensive. Why is that the case?
It's hard to say exactly why, but there are a lot of factors that feed into what makes up a ticket price. Certainly an important part of that is the passenger fee and the security fee that the airport charges. Now, most airports, regional airports, are owned by the local council, and airports are typically trying to get to the stage where they're not burdening the ratepayer, so they want to get to the stage where they're at least breaking even, but many airports can't achieve that, so they end up being subsidised by the community, which is a little bit unfair on the rest of the community. But if you keep putting the prices up for the passenger fees and security charges, that means that people are less likely to fly, which puts more pressure on those prices, so it's hard to strike that balance. So that's one part of it. Certainly one of the issues around airports that councils certainly struggle with is there are so many regulatory processes that councils need to go through to make sure they satisfy the federal requirements. We have had discussions at regional cities and certainly regional capitals Australia as well with the federal government in particular about more funding availability for regional airports. And one example is security screening. No one argues that security screening is a bad idea. We all think that security screening is a good idea. But the cost of security screening is significant, and you can talk about, depending on the airport size and the volume of people going through there, it could be anywhere from, say, $5 to maybe $15 or maybe even $20 per passenger that goes through that. Now, that obviously gets charged back to the airline. The airline obviously adds that to the ticket price, and it's all about volume. The higher volume you have going through an airport, obviously the cheaper it becomes for the per ticket price from a security screening because the security personnel are typically there. So passenger fees, security screening and volume are all contributors to higher ticket prices.
I think a narrative that comes up a lot, particularly with Coffs Airport, where we've seen, multiple airlines come and go, is the monopolisation of particular airlines. Would you say that comes into play when we look at ticket prices?
There's no doubt about it that having a monopoly is certainly an easier way for an airline to charge a higher fee. Competition is very important. And one of the things that's difficult for a council or an airport owner to control is the different airlines that might come along to that particular airport. Every council out there, every airport would love to have 2-3 different airlines servicing every route. But again, there's only a little bit that you can do from the airport perspective, and that really comes down to the passenger fees that are being charged to try and encourage different airlines. But then again, you're doing that, you're then putting that cost back on to the ratepayers. So competition is certainly important, and we see that across the board. And with the troubles that Rex had a couple of months ago, and obviously still going through that process, that put a bit of a shockwave through regional airports, because if Rex was lost to those regional airports, that would either leave airports without anyone servicing them or potentially a monopoly for one airline, which again would put upward pressure on those prices. So absolutely we would love to see more competition, but we've seen a few airlines come and go in the Australian market, and that's the real challenge with the population numbers we have and just how large a country it is, trying to get that competition with a viable airline industry.
Yeah, and there's no doubt it feels like a really catch-22 here because, you know, we know from this petition that there's been over 1,500 signatures in 3 days, and it's a very common narrative that there is demand out of Coffs Harbour, but locals are forced to drive 2.5 hours to Ballina or down to Port Macquarie to access more affordable flights to get to metropolitan areas like Sydney and Melbourne. So, you know, where to next here? Because, you know, as the more that ticket prices rise, the less customers they're going to get. So, yeah, where to from here? How can we make, ticket prices more affordable?
And that's a real challenge there. If you look at Ballina, I would estimate that Ballina would probably have 3 times the number of passengers going through Ballina Airport compared to Coffs Harbour. So that certainly makes it easier from a cost from the council perspective, also makes it easier for airlines from a competition perspective. So that makes it very tough. At Regional Capitals Australia, we've certainly had discussions with the federal government to say that to be fair, to be giving equity of access to people that live in regional locations, we think that more work needs to be done by the federal government to support regional airports. And we're talking about financial support. And one of the things that is significant with a regional airport is that the day-to-day running, paying for the staff to run security screening, for example, paying for the staff to run the airport, you're trying to cover those costs with the passenger fees that you're charging. But when it comes to any upgrade to the airport, they're incredibly expensive. Anything to do with the runway is expensive. Anything to do with the airport terminal is expensive. So that's where we think we really need a lot more help from the federal government to get significant help, especially with those major infrastructure upgrades. It's very difficult to cover all of those with the passenger fees. So that's certainly the angle. In answer to your question, where to from here, keep putting pressure on the federal government in particular, more so than the state government. We think this is more a federal government issue to try and get to that point where we're getting better support, financial support to help run those airports. If we can do that, we can keep the passenger fees lower. That means less of those passenger fees or a lower amount is charged onto the airline, which is then charged onto the passengers. So hopefully then that can increase the volume, which makes it easier for the airlines and easier for the airport owners.
I'm interested in talking a bit more about these passenger fees. How is it guaranteed if an airport does in fact lower those passenger fees? And I'd be interested to hear from you what an average passenger fee cost is across New South Wales regional airports. But if an airport, for example, does lower that, what's the guarantee that an airline that does, we know in Coffs Harbour Airport, for example, there are only 2 airlines operating there at the moment. What's to say, is it guaranteed that they will lower their ticket prices?
That's always the risk when you lower a passenger fee, less money coming into the airport. The airline themselves could just take that as additional profit. But if there's competition there, if, for example, the passenger fee was reduced by $10, for example, then you would hope the competition would mean that they would pass that saving on. There are times when I've seen various discussions and deals being done with airlines to say, if you reach a certain volume, then passenger fees will be reduced after that volume, which you must pass on in cheaper ticket prices. But it's a complicated market because anyone that's booked an airline ticket knows there are so many different prices that are charged for the different seats on the airline, how early you book, how full that plane is. So it's very difficult to see that it's directly passed on. In answer to your earlier question, airline or passenger fees typically across the state would be anywhere from maybe $15 to potentially $30 per passenger, and then security screening fees can be on top of that, maybe $5 to $15, and there's huge variations there, mainly based around volume. So it is difficult to see where you actually can have a direct correlation between cheaper passenger fees and cheaper ticket prices. But if someone's talking about ticket prices being $100 cheaper at a different airport, $150 cheaper, those prices are not directly driven by passenger fees because passenger fees don't make up all of that. It's really about...
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you because, in this case, when you compare prices between Ballarat and Coffs, for example, it is like $400 or $500 cheaper to drive up to Ballina. So it does look like it does look like that it is more than just those passenger fees.
Yeah, that's right. I suspect that a lot of the difference there is the actual competition there and the volume. So as I mentioned, approximately 3 times the number of passengers going through Ballina Airport compared to Coffs Harbour. And that means you've got more competition. That means you've got more airlines fighting for those passengers. And competition is a wonderful thing to keep prices lower in a free market, in a supply and demand market. So that's probably more of that. And then the challenge becomes, if you want to get cheaper ticket prices in Coffs Harbour, how do you get more passengers flying in and out of Coffs Harbour? That's the real answer. Or, as you find with some airports around the world, there is some government subsidy process available where you can actually have some sort of payment to airlines to fly into those particular airports. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the absolute solution in New South Wales, but it certainly does work in other places in the world, and certainly in places like Western Australia, they have that sort of process for some regional airports as well. So really to try and give regional residents some sort of equity of access to those services that they need out of the capital city.
Yeah, and the white paper came out back in August this year. At the time, it was critical of the regional airport services and acknowledging that there was a monopoly in in those departments. What has come since the white paper's come out? What were some of the recommendations that have been put into motion at the moment?
Well, nothing specific in place at the moment. There's certainly some variety of things that have been suggested in that white paper. One of them certainly was better funding availability for regional airports, and nothing really has changed in that space yet. And keep in mind, we're only talking about a couple of months ago, and so things move a bit slower than that. The other one that's certainly important out of that white paper was giving better access or guaranteed access to Sydney Airport. Now, we've got a second airport that's being built in Sydney at the moment. We're concerned from a regional perspective that maybe all those regional ports will be pushed out to the second Sydney airport, which wouldn't be ideal. We're going to make sure we've still got access to the main airport in Sydney and making sure we keep that, but also the slots. And this is where it becomes very complicated because slots are, in inverted commas, owned by the airlines. Not really owned by the airlines, but if you've got a slot as an airline, whatever you're using that slot, you get to keep it. And that means that restricts competition. So freeing up slots, having a better process for slots, maybe having a bid process for slots on an ongoing basis, maybe an annual basis, maybe somewhere where every couple of years you could bid for those slots, that would open up competition because at the moment it's very difficult for another airline to come and compete against those airlines that have already got those slots. So that's certainly an important part of that, and that review is happening as we speak.
Yeah, it's obviously a very complicated issue, but I appreciate you unpacking that. Thank you so much for your time, Matthew.
Thank you, Jasmine. My pleasure.